Imagine the crowd in the store freezing in horror. The clerk, face twisted with anger, tears the dress of a young black woman. Her eyes fill with tears, and the silence that follows feels like it cuts the air. Only after it happened did he begin to realize the heinousness of his act. But the most horrifying truth waited ahead. Who her father was changed everything. Friends, where do you think this horror story will lead? Share in the comments what your name is and what city you're watching this video from. Your words and support are incredibly important to us. You make this channel special, and every reaction helps us move forward and create more exciting content. We appreciate you more than we can put into words. Each of your names and each place you look from becomes part of our large and friendly family. You are our inspiration, and we are eternally grateful to have you with us. The store was a quiet, sterile world, filled with expensive items and cold smiles. The uniformed salesmen stood in strict postures like sentries, watching each visitor with veiled suspicion. But their gazes became especially wary when dark-skinned customers came through the doors. The atmosphere was saturated with a barely concealed racial intolerance. The unspoken words hung in the air like ghosts, and the judgmental stares were their silent embodiment. One of these salesmen was Mr. Harper. On the surface, he appeared to be an ordinary salesman, neatly dressed, with immaculate hair and a polished manner of speech. But behind his polite mask lurked a deep-seated dislike for those he considered inappropriate visitors. In his thoughts, he often condemned those who, in his opinion, did not fit into this space, as if it were a sacred temple for a select few. When the black-skinned woman entered the store, Harper noticed her at once. His lips pressed into a thin line, and he felt a surge of distaste. She didn't belong here, he thought, her presence defiling this abode of expensive fabrics and high-end fragrances. Harper couldn't help the contemptuous glance he cast in her direction, full of conviction of his superiority. This store was his territory, his safe place, where he felt unshakable. And at this moment, unaware that one encounter would change everything, Harper savored that sense of power. When she entered the store, her steps were light but confident. The dress slid down her body, elegant and refined, and there was a simple but charming smile on her face. However, that smile quickly began to fade as soon as she felt the first wave of shock from the cold, contemptuous stare. The entire store seemed to freeze for a moment. Even the air seemed to thicken with distaste. Instantly, the woman felt the atmosphere around her become heavy and overwhelming. Her gaze crossed Mr. Harper's, and there was not a hint of greeting or professional courtesy in that look. Only chilling contempt and silent condemnation. She felt as if his eyes were burning through her, as if her presence was in itself a challenge to which he saw fit to respond with hatred. Her back tensed, but she straightened even more. She knew those looks were not accidental. She'd seen it repeatedly, in stores, on the streets, in restaurants. She didn't need to hear the words to know that she wasn't expected or wanted to be here. The vendors behind the cash registers looked at her silently, expressing quiet displeasure at her presence. Even some of the customers looked away discreetly, trying not to meet her gaze, but still their bodies expressed an underlying tension. She felt an invisible weight on her shoulders, but she tried not to show weakness. Her grandmother had once taught her that dignity was her strength, and now she clung to that reminder. But the atmosphere of intolerance here was too thick, too obvious. The woman knew she would have to be especially strong to endure this moment and keep her composure. Mr. Harper watched the woman with an expression on his face more suited to a strict judge than a salesman. His jaw was clenched, and his eyebrows moved slightly, giving his face a hard, almost contemptuous expression. His eyes, cold and piercing, followed her every move. He stood motionless, arms crossed over his chest as if he wanted to emphasize his superiority. His thoughts were dark and hateful, though a strained, almost mocking smile played on his lips. Deep down, Harper was convinced that this store was a place where people like her shouldn't be. He felt protective of the upscale atmosphere that he felt the black woman was defiling with her presence. Humiliating thoughts rattled around in his head. What does she want here? Does she really think she can afford any of these goods? These racist thoughts fueled his inner sense of superiority. He looked down at her, not even bothering to hide his dislike. To him, she was not a person, but the embodiment of all the prejudices he had nurtured over the years to feed his sense of power. Harper didn't even try to be polite. He savored this moment when he could look at her in a way that no one else would dare to look at those he considered equals. His posture and facial expression radiated a clear message. "You're a stranger here, and I'll make sure you feel it." The woman approached the counter, trying to ignore the heavy atmosphere and gathering all her dignity into a strong, impenetrable shell. Her voice sounded soft but confident as she addressed Mr. Harper. "Excuse me, could you please help me with this dress? I'd like to try it on." Her words sounded like a simple and polite request, the same one that dozens of customers made every day. To Mr. Harper, however, the words sounded like an irritating challenge. His eyebrows rose sharply, and he looked at her as if she had just asked for the impossible. His eyes flashed with latent aggression, and he barely restrained himself from betraying his true feelings. "Is that a dress?" he said, stretching his words as if he doubted she even knew what he was talking about. His voice was imbued with sarcasm and a subtle hint of contempt. "It's a very expensive thing, you understand?" he added with pressure, his gaze fixed on her eyes. The woman felt her dignity hurt at the hint, but she held her ground. She knew it was the result of prejudiced thinking, and she wasn't going to give him any reason to think he'd won. "Yes, I understand," she replied calmly, keeping her tone even and showing no offense. Her restraint only irritated Harper more. His irritation was boiling over, though he tried to hide it behind a strained smile. He took a step closer, and his voice became a quieter, almost threatening whisper. "Make sure you're careful with that," he said, his eyes narrowed. Every word seemed to drip with venom, and there was an underlying threat, as if he expected her to do something wrong beforehand. He gave her a scornful look of arrogant distrust. The woman, despite all the experience that had taught her to deal with such situations, felt her heart beat faster. There was not only a polite request in this clash, but also an invisible war that was unfolding between her dignity and his hatred. Mr. Harper clenched his jaw, trying to hold on to the remnants of politeness, but with every move she made, his irritation flared more and more. He watched as she carefully picked up the dress, and a sudden feeling of rage filled his chest. He found it intolerable that she dared to behave so confidently in this sacred space that he considered inviolable territory for people of her race. His face hardened, his gaze darkened, and there was a sharpness in his every movement. He stepped closer, pretending to care about the dress, but his gesture was more threatening than caring. There was no longer even a semblance of friendliness in his voice. Instead, there was outright hostility. "I said be careful," he repeated with a venomous tone that no longer tried to hide his true feelings. Something more than mere irritation flashed in his eyes. It was hatred, old and commonplace, built on prejudice and deep prejudice. The woman felt his hostility literally burning her. His whole appearance, from his clenched fist to his evil squint, was full of contempt. He was no longer trying to appear professional. His hatred, previously hidden behind a thin mask, was now spilling out. Her presence had become something unbearable, repugnant to him. She tried to remain calm, realizing that any emotional reaction would only encourage him to attack again. But standing in this room, feeling his hostility, was like balancing on a fine line between vulnerability and a desperate need to defend herself. Mr. Harper stood directly in front of her, his breathing heavy, as if her very existence caused him pain. At that moment, everything in him screamed that he wanted to see her humiliated, broken, to confirm his sense of superiority. Mr. Harper could hold back no longer. The inner venom he carried within him came out in the form of cruel words. He stepped closer to the woman, so close that she felt his cold gaze penetrating her through. His voice was low but loud enough for the other visitors to hear, and perhaps even back him up in silent approval. "You know," he began with a sneer, grinning so that his face contorted into a malicious grimace, "this sort of thing isn't usually reserved for people of your caliber." He paused, emphasizing his word level, and his eyes narrowed with contempt. The woman felt the words burning her like hot coals. She could see the people around her trying to pretend not to hear, though everyone was well aware of what was going on. Some of the visitors glanced away from under their foreheads, and some of them looked away from the tense confrontation. The salesman continued, enjoying his sense of power and the insolence with which he allowed himself to humiliate her. "You know, this place is not for everyone." He made a meaningful gesture with his hands as if pointing to the whole space around him. "We value here sophistication and status," he added, as if she were the embodiment of everything he despised. The woman pressed her lips together, trying not to show how much those words hurt her. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her broken. She knew his purpose was clear: to humiliate her, to make her feel alien, unworthy. He relished the insolence, feeding off her supposed weakness, and his racist remarks added to the tension in the air. Harper took a step back, pleased with his performance. He was sure he'd put her in her place, that his racist outbursts had left her defenseless. But deep inside, he didn't know that every moment of his humiliation only brought closer the moment when he himself would have to pay for his hatred. Mr. Harper's words, full of venom and contempt, hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating fog. He felt his hostility only growing stronger, fueled by the silent support of those around him. It seemed as if the store itself had become his ally. The windows, the staring eyes of the customers, the stern, closed faces of the clerks. All of it reinforced his sense of self-righteousness and impunity. Hostility was growing not only in him, but also among some of the visitors. An elderly couple standing at the cash register cast judgmental glances at the black woman as if to confirm that she really wasn't welcome here. Another man dressed in a business suit shook his head quietly, as if agreeing with Harper's thoughts that not everyone belongs here. Their silence wasn't just neutrality, it was a silent sign of approval, an unspoken agreement with the racist words coming out of the salesman's mouth. Mr. Harper felt it. He could feel his hatred becoming almost palpable, like a wave gaining strength and ready to crash with renewed power. He savored it, enjoyed the way the others chose to look the other way, or support him with their approving silence. It gave him courage, confidence in his impunity, and even the right to insult and humiliate. His lips curled into a smug grin. "You know," he said louder so that everyone could hear him, "some things just aren't worth touching if you can't pay for them." His words were filled with subtle venom, another humiliation aimed straight at the woman's heart. He savored the situation, increasing the tension with every word. His hostility was no longer hidden behind politeness. It spilled out like a corrosive poison, and he knew that he was supported by the silent stares of a society that shared his hatred. Every moment he felt more and more invulnerable, unaware that this illusion of power was about to be shattered in a most unexpected way. Mr. Harper decided to move from covert innuendo to outright provocation. He knew that his power here was almost absolute, and he believed that the black woman had neither the ability nor the strength to fight back. He relished his role as aggressor, and his every move and word was aimed at making her feel insignificant and humiliated. He stepped closer, his face contorted in a grin full of malice and smugness. "Oh, let me help you," he said with feigned concern, his voice drenched in sarcasm. He snatched the dress from her hands abruptly, as if he feared she might ruin it. "You know, we don't usually let you try on things of this caliber." He paused, emphasizing the contempt in his voice. "Customers who don't look, you know, dignified." His words were like a punch in the face, and he could see her struggling to control herself, her eyes glittering with offense, but she held back. Harper grinned, seeing that his insults had achieved their purpose. But the woman would not allow herself to answer him with rudeness. It fueled an even greater sense of superiority in him. He took a step back and threw the dress on the counter with theatrical carelessness, as if it had suddenly become dirty just because her hands had touched it. "Do you really think it's yours?" he asked, deliberately emphasizing the word yours with a sneer. "Perhaps there is something simpler and more affordable for you. We can offer you discounts on things from last season." The words cut like a knife. He savored every second of it, watching the way she pressed her lips together, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she tried to hold herself together. Harper was sure she would leave now, humiliated and broken, that she would never dare to answer him, for in this place he considered himself untouchable. He deliberately kept provoking her, drawing out the moment when she would be forced to leave. He knew that he had humiliated her in front of the entire audience of the store, and his every gesture, every word was carefully calculated to make her realize that he was in charge, that she had no place among decent people. Harper felt himself at the pinnacle of his supposed triumph. His heart was racing with excitement, and his anger, fueled by the silent approval of those around him, was growing stronger. The woman stood before him, proud and calm, but her silence, her steadfastness, fueled his rage. He wanted to break her, to make her feel as helpless and insignificant as he thought she deserved. He suddenly grabbed the dress she'd chosen, his fingers gripping the delicate fabric tightly. His eyes glittered with contempt, and a flame of cruel satisfaction flashed in them. "You know what?" he said through gritted teeth, his voice filled with open anger. "That dress doesn't fit you." Before anyone could intervene, Mr. Harper pulled the dress sharply, and with a loud crack, the fabric tore in his hands. The shock sent a rumble through the hall. The woman's eyes widened and pain flashed across her face as she saw the graceful dress split in two. That sound, that gesture, was not just the destruction of a thing, it was humiliation, open and cruel. The moment seemed like an eternity. People froze, some wide-eyed, others glancing around nervously, as if unable to believe what had just happened. Some of the visitors were secretly enjoying the spectacle, feeling part of this act of suppression, but some began to feel a growing unease, realizing that the line had been crossed. The woman stood, her breath hitched, but she held on despite the humiliation that seemed to hang in the air and press down on her from all sides. Harper looked at her with pride, as if he expected her to fall to her knees broken. He was sure of his impunity, sure that no one would dare oppose him, but he did not know that with this cruel action, he had set in motion a chain of events that would fundamentally change his life. At that moment, the tension reached its climax. The woman, humiliated in front of everyone, had a fire in her eyes, and behind that fire lurked a power Harper could not have known he had. After the tearing of the dress, there was a dead silence in the store. It was as if the world stood still, struck by the cruelty and outright hatred which Mr. Harper had just displayed. Even the air seemed to freeze, soaked with shock and tension, and time stood still for a moment. All eyes were fixed on the woman who stood with the torn dress in her hands, her face expressing a mixture of pain, resentment, and shock. Some of those present were stunned. A young couple standing nearby took each other's hands, their faces pale at what they saw. A woman in a business suit covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with horror. These people could not believe that this had happened right in front of them, that the cruelty and humiliation was so open, so raw. However, not everyone in the store shared the shock. A group of middle-aged men standing by the display case of expensive watches looked at each other and grinned slightly. Their facial expressions indicated that they approved of Harper's action, seeing it as something that they felt confirmed the order of things. One of them even allowed himself a barely audible chuckle, as if what had happened was amusing and justified. A few of the older ladies at the accessories department threw glances at each other, filled with silent agreement. To them, this was just confirmation that people of her caliber shouldn't be in places like this. Their cold, approving eyes only emphasized the racist dynamic that permeated the space. But there were those who looked away, as if trying not to see. A man in a business suit flipped nervously through a magazine, hiding his face behind the pages, his hands trembling. An elderly woman clutched her bag, her gaze fixed on the floor as if she was afraid to meet her eyes with what had just happened. They didn't want to get involved, didn't want to take responsibility, but their silence was also part of the bigger picture, the picture of a society that either tacitly supports or chooses inaction. The woman with the torn dress stood in the center of this chaos, and her face remained firm despite her humiliation. She knew that here and now she was alone, surrounded by a multitude of people who were either gloating or afraid to speak out against injustice. There was a heavy energy in the air, reflecting the cracks and painful rifts in this society where hatred and indifference often went hand in hand. The woman stood in the middle of the store, holding the torn dress in her hands, and felt bitterness and resentment rise to her throat. Her eyes filled with tears, which she tried desperately to hold back. Emotions raged inside her: rage, pain, humiliation. These feelings were tearing at her like a storm, threatening to overwhelm her and drown her in an ocean of despair. She felt her pride and dignity crumble to dust under the weight of cruel stares and indifferent silence. The tears were treacherous. She hated the fact that they might betray her weakness in front of these men, in front of those who enjoyed her humiliation. Tears meant that he had won, that Mr. Harper's cruelty had achieved its goal. She felt a shiver run through her body, but at the same moment a rage rose from the depths of her being, hot, all-consuming, not allowing her to give up. She straightened, clenched her teeth, and tried to hold back her tears. Her grandmother had always told her that strength was the ability to remain dignified even in moments of deepest humiliation. And now those words were ringing in her ears like a reminder, like a guide to action. She didn't let herself fall, didn't let herself break, even when every eye in the room seemed intent on crushing her. A fire burned in her heart, a fire she knew no one could extinguish. She knew this moment was not just a humiliation, but a challenge. She clutched the fabric of her torn dress, as if gathering strength from each piece. This was her battle, and she had to endure. Her tears were not a sign of defeat. They were a sign that she was still human, that the pain was real, that her soul was not petrified. But along with the pain came determination. She looked at Mr. Harper, her eyes sparkling despite the tears. There was more than resentment in them. There was defiance, an unwavering steadfastness that said, "You can try to humiliate me, but I'll still stand. I'm stronger than you think." The store was filled with tension. Her tears flowed down her cheeks, but they were tears of strength, not weakness. She knew that this moment did not define her, that her dignity was not something that could be destroyed with one torn dress and insult. She remained standing, unbreakable, despite the pain, despite the insult, because there was a strength in her heart that no hatred could destroy. Mr. Harper stood, satisfied with his act, watching the woman with a look of obvious satisfaction on his face. His lips curved in a smug smile that left no doubt that he was enjoying every moment of the humiliation he had just inflicted. The gleam of triumph in his eyes told that he was sure of his total impunity. He felt that he was the ruler of this space, a man whose position and status allowed him to do whatever he wanted without fear of repercussions. He looked back at the crowd, and that only made him more confident. No one had dared to intervene. No one had spoken in defense of the woman. Harper regarded this as his own personal affirmation of rightness. In their silence, he saw support, and in their averted glances, he saw silent approval. He savored this moment of triumph as if it were an affirmation of his supposed superiority. "Well," he said loudly so that everyone could hear his words, "perhaps next time you should think twice before coming to places like this." He spoke with contempt, emphasizing each word as if they were sharp blades aimed at the woman. His smug smile only grew wider as he watched her try to maintain the remnants of her dignity. For Harper, this was a game he felt he was winning. He had no idea that there might be forces outside the store that could destroy his illusion of invulnerability. There was not a hint of thought in his mind about the consequences. He was sure that everything would remain as it was. He and his position, unshaken, she humiliated and broken. Harper even took a step back, as if to better savor his victory. His body was relaxed and his arms were crossed confidently over his chest, in a posture that showed power and control. He was so sure of his rightness and support that there was no room for doubt or fear in his mind. All he saw before him was the affirmation of his power and the weakness of the one he had just tried to break. Mr. Harper's inner monologue was filled with bitter, lingering prejudices that fueled his sense of self-superiority. Long ingrained in his mind were ideas about who in this society was worthy of respect and who was not. He looked at the black woman with contempt, not even trying to realize the cruelty of his own views. Everything was black and white to him, the division between those who belong here and those who never can. They come here thinking they can be equals, Harper thought with inner gloating. They try to pretend they can live on par with us, wear expensive clothes, act like they're on our level. But the truth is, they can never measure up. These thoughts swirled around in his head, fueling his self-confidence. He thought of himself as the keeper of order, the person who made sure that people like her knew their place. He liked to feel superior, liked to feel power over those he despised. For him, humiliating a woman was not just an incident, but part of a necessary lesson he felt it was right to teach. "They'll never be like us," he thought, crossing his arms over his chest and grinning. "Money can't buy them dignity or status. Let them think they can be part of this world, but they will always stand apart, watching from afar, no matter how much they try to pretend." There was no room for doubt in his mind, not even the slightest hint of understanding or sympathy. All that filled him was the certainty that what he had done was justified. He believed he was protecting the purity of this space, his world, where those like him had power and those like her had to meekly accept their position. Harper saw nothing wrong with his behavior. On the contrary, he believed that he had done the right thing, that his actions confirmed his conviction that order and hierarchy must be preserved. With these thoughts, he stood there, absorbed in his arrogance, not even realizing that every moment of his inner triumph brought closer the moment when everything would change. The silence in the store quickly began to fill with muffled whispers, as if people were finally able to exhale, but still trying to speak quietly enough to keep their words within their small groups. The customers looked at each other, exchanged opinions, and in their conversations they could hear both support for the salesman's behavior and fear of interference. "Well, he's right, you know," whispered a man in a business suit standing next to his wife. "People like that really often don't know their place." He was just reminding her of that. His wife nodded in agreement, though there was something troubled in her gaze, as if she were trying to justify this rigidity to assuage her own sense of unease. A noise in the store attracted the attention of one of the managers, who quickly approached the scene. He was a middle-aged man with carefully styled hair and an expensive watch on his wrist, symbolizing his status. His face expressed a carefully rehearsed politeness, but his eyes showed nervousness. The incident had become too visible, and it had to be resolved somehow to preserve the store's reputation. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, madam," he said, addressing the woman with a strained, dutiful smile. His words sounded hollow, like a learned speech, devoid of real regret or sympathy. "We sincerely regret that such a situation has occurred." But his eyes on Mr. Harper said something else, support and understanding, as if he saw nothing particularly outrageous in his actions. The woman was still standing, clutching the torn dress, her face tense and tears still glistening on her cheeks. The apology sounded like a sneer, a formality that had no sincerity underneath. The manager seemed only concerned that the incident not draw too much attention. He did not even attempt to punish Harper or condemn his behavior. "You see," the manager continued, raising his voice slightly so that everyone could hear, "we have strict standards here, and our staff is just trying to keep order." There was no hint of condemnation of the salesman's actions in those words, only justification. His speech was colored by the same racist prejudice as Harper's. It seemed to justify what had happened, questioning a woman's right to be in this space. The woman looked at the manager with pain and disbelief. She felt her humiliation only intensify under the weight of these hypocritical apologies. They offered no solution, no justice. Instead, the store management was trying to erase the incident, to turn it into a minor misunderstanding that wasn't worth the attention. "We'll offer you a discount to make up for this awkward situation," the manager added, his smile even wider, even more fake. The offer sounded like a slap in the face, as if they could make up for the insult with money, as if this humiliation could be measured in a percentage discount. It was the final confirmation that to them she was not a person with dignity and feelings, but merely an inconvenience to be smoothed over. There was a tense silence in the hall again. The people around them watched the store management try to cover up what had happened, and the woman realized that this place, this world, was not going to be fair. Her pain, her humiliation didn't matter to them, and their useless, racially colored apologies only added to the wound they had already inflicted. The doors of the store suddenly opened with a slight bang, and a tall man with a posture that instantly caught the eyes of all present entered. His figure, powerful and confident, gave the impression of a man accustomed to authority and respect. He was dressed in an elegant business suit that emphasized his influence, and there was a fire in his eyes that sent a chill down my spine. This was a man not to be underestimated, In the blink of an eye, the atmosphere in the store changed. Those who a moment ago had felt safe in humiliating others felt their confidence cracked. Mr. Harper, who until that moment had been standing with a smug grin, felt the grin slowly slipping from his face. His hands involuntarily trembled and his heart beat faster. He didn't know who the man was, but his gaze, hard and penetrating, inspired real fear. The man looked around, and when he saw the woman with the torn dress and crying face, his eyes darkened with anger. There was no pity in that look, only rage and determination to protect her. He approached her with quick but confident steps, his presence dispelling the fear and silent hatred that hung in the air. This was a man who was clearly ready to mete out justice, no matter what it cost him. Mr. Harper made an effort to pull himself together, but his voice trembled treacherously as he tried to speak. "What can I help you, sir?" He tried to sound confident, but under the man's gaze he felt his strength and smugness melt away. His skin was covered with cold sweat, and his fingers clenched nervously into fists. The man said nothing. He only continued to stare at Harper with such intensity that it seemed to burn through him. The people around him froze, holding their breath, not knowing what would happen next. The store manager, hitherto confident in his ability to handle the situation, looked confused and frightened, his voice low, and he took a step back. This man was more than just a protector. His presence commanded respect, a reminder that strength and justice can come when you least expect it. He was here to protect a woman, to show everyone that her dignity could not be torn as easily as the fabric of a dress. And those who had felt safe humiliating others were now afraid that justice would finally catch up with them. Mr. Harper stood frozen as the man stepped closer. His posture, decisive strides, and facial expression spoke of a strength and power that was impossible to ignore. This was the type of man before whom people involuntarily slacken their shoulders, feel their confidence momentarily leave them. The man's gaze glanced around the room, noting every detail, every face, but stopped on Mr. Harper as if pinning him in place. Harper's heart clenched with foreboding. He tried to take a step back, but his feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. The man who had just entered was coming straight toward him, his eyes focused and his jaw clenched in suppressed anger. Those around him held their breath, sensing that something significant was coming, something imminent. The man approached the woman with the torn dress, and his gaze, full of concern and fury, softened for a moment. He put his hand gently on her shoulder, as if protecting her from the world. She raised her eyes to his, and in them flashed a mixture of relief and gratitude, but also unrelenting pain. Their bond was obvious, and everyone around them, including Mr. Harper, began to realize that there was more than just a protector standing before them. "Minus Mr. Harper, isn't it?" the man said, and his voice was deep, sonorous, penetrating. It was neither shouting nor threatening, but every letter was so strong that Harper felt panic rising inside him. The salesman swallowed, trying to regain his self-confidence. "Yes," he mumbled, trying not to shake. "What can I do for you, sir?" The man kept his gaze on him, and at that moment it came to Harper. He remembered the pictures in the news, the articles about men whose influence extended far beyond their business successes. This was a man with power, a man whose name could send shivers down the spine of those who were used to considering themselves untouchable. Mr. Harper realized that standing before him was none other than one of the most powerful and respected men in the city, the woman's father. It was as if a bolt of lightning struck Harper as the realization of the depth of his mistake finally caught up with him. This was a man whose power extended far beyond this store, a man whose connections could destroy careers and lives with a single movement. Harper felt his confidence crumble to dust, and his face grew pale. He realized that what he had thought was an insignificant prank had now taken on enormous consequences. The silence in the store became even more oppressive. Those around him could not take their eyes off the dramatic collision. Everyone waited to see what would happen next, sensing that the moment of reckoning had arrived, and those who a moment ago had been silently supporting Harper now began to realize that the consequences could be devastating. When Harper realized who stood before him, a wave of chilling fear coursed through his body. Everything that had seemed so secure and unshakable to him had suddenly collapsed. leaving him utterly helpless. The smug confidence that had fueled his insolence for so long evaporated, leaving only emptiness and a panicked shiver. His hands, which had been clutching the fabric of the torn dress, were now shaking with terror. Everything inside him felt cold, and he felt a chill creeping up his spine. Every look, every facial expression of those around him seemed to be directed directly at him. Now not with approval, but with condemnation and bewilderment, as if they themselves had just realized what had happened. Harper tried to swallow, but his throat was dry, and the words stuck in him like heavy stones. He felt his legs go cotton, and he was barely kept from falling by the strained remnants of his composure. He wanted to disappear, to vanish from this store, from this situation that had suddenly turned against him. But he was chained to the place as if invisible shackles held him, preventing him from escaping. The man, the woman's father, was looking at him, and in that gaze Harper saw all the power, all the rage he could not even imagine. It wasn't just anger, but the cold, deadly calm of a man who was well aware of his power and ready to use it. Harper knew that this man was not to be trifled with, and the realization of it was eating him up inside, exposing his insignificance. "Suck it, oh no, do you realize what you've done?" the man asked, and his voice was quiet, but there was more menace in that silence than in any shout. Harper could hardly control himself. His breathing had become ragged and his face deathly pale. He felt how all eyes were now fixed upon him with judgment and contempt, how the silent complicity of the crowd had turned against him. Harper wanted to say something, to justify himself, but the words wouldn't come. His mind raced for a way out, but found nothing but emptiness and horror. The impunity he had been sure of for so long had crumbled to dust. Now he saw that every deed he had done, every insult had consequences, and that retribution was inevitable. His fear shackled him, turning him into a helpless, pathetic man who realized that he had done something for which he would have to pay dearly. Mr. Harper stood motionless, his heart pounding frantically in his chest. The realization of cruel reality came over him, wiping away the last vestiges of his self-confidence. Everything around him suddenly lost its familiar shape. The store that had been his safe fortress was now a cage from which he could not escape. Every object, every person seemed to stare at him with silent judgment. His gaze swept over the faces of those gathered. Those who a moment ago had seemed his silent allies now looked on with disapproval or disappointment. Even the manager, who had seemed willing to justify his actions, looked tense and frightened. An oppressive silence hung in the room, and Harper felt it pressing down on him like a slab of stone, preventing him from taking a breath. The man before him, the woman's father, embodied everything that now threatened his world. Harper began to realize that his reckless actions had made his future depend on the favor of this powerful man. The power that had previously seemed immovable to Harper now hung by a thread. He was no longer the proud defender of his store, but a man who had ruined everything he had with a single moment of hatred. I didn't mean to," he mumbled, but the words were empty, powerless. Even he felt that they meant nothing, that apologies now could not undo what had been done. He remembered everything, the hatred with which he had torn the dress, the contemptuous words he had spoken. It all sounded in his head now, like a sentence, like something he couldn't undo. His mind was racing with panic. He saw all his dreams and illusions of impunity crumble. Mr. Harper began to realize that the consequences would be real and brutal. His career could be over, his reputation on the brink of destruction. Everything he had built and believed he was entitled to was now threatening to crumble into dust. His lips trembled, his hands were cold, and for the first time in his life, he felt that his power and authority were illusions, behind which was only a fragile sense of his own greatness. The world he had built for so long was now cracking at the seams, and none of those who had shared his views were coming to his aid. He realized that payback was inevitable, that his pride and hatred had now turned against him, shattering his former confidence and turning him into a pathetic, broken figure. The whole store was enveloped in a tense and heavy silence. Everyone who had witnessed the incident stood as if chained to the spot, their eyes fixed on what was happening. Just now there had been a familiar, safe confidence in the place, based on a tacit agreement and animosity that had never met any real opposition. But now everything had changed. The surrounding faces, which had previously looked with approval or indifference at Mr. Harper's actions, were now seized with frightened confusion. The woman standing at the jewelry counter was clutching her bag tightly to her eyes wide with fear. She tried not to draw attention to herself, but her breathing became heavy and frequent, as if she were in the center of a scene that had suddenly become too dangerous. The elderly couple, who had been expressing approval a moment ago, looked at each other with obvious concern. The man nervously adjusted his glasses and the woman clasped her hand to her chest as if her heart were racing too fast. They realized that the situation was out of order and that their acquiescence now seemed pathetic. They no longer felt safe, unable to justify what had happened when faced with the anger and power of a man who could not be ignored. The young couple, who had been quietly discussing what had happened, now looked anxious and confused. The boy clutched his girlfriend's hand, and their fingers turned white with tension. They tried to guess what would happen next, but in their eyes they could read the horror of the inevitable denouement. This was not just a scene, not just an argument to be forgotten. This was the moment when the mask of safety and indifference came off, and it was clear that everyone would be affected. A mother with a small child in her arms, standing by the children's clothing section, clutched the baby so tightly that he began to cry quietly. Her eyes wandered around the hall, and her face was frozen with anxiety. She realized that she had no place in this conflict, that she could not intervene, but her fear for the baby made her look for a way out, a way to escape what was unfolding in front of her. The cashiers behind the counters looked paralyzed. One of them, a young man with a frightened face, was frantically clutching a pen, hesitant to make a move. The other employees did not know whether to intervene or to stand aside, which might save them from the wrath of someone as powerful as the woman's father. Everyone in the store realized that they were no longer mere spectators, that silence now would not save them from the consequences. Fear permeated their ranks, shackling them, making them realize that they were complicit, that their indifference had supported the hatred that had now turned into disaster. People realized that the situation was out of control, and each of them felt part of this protracted confrontation that could no longer be ignored. No one else could hide behind their usual masks. Everyone could feel the tension rising, the approaching denouement in which they would have to face their own cowardice and hypocrisy. The man whose entrance to the store had already turned the usual notion of security and impunity upside down, finally spoke. His voice was low and confident, without an ounce of emotion, but it was this restraint that made every word sound like a thunderclap. He was no longer looking at the woman in harm's way. His gaze was now focused entirely on Mr. Harper, who stood trying to hold himself up, but his body shook faintly with fear. "Minus Mr. Harper," the man said, and the very utterance of his name made the salesman wince as if he had been caught in the act. "I've been watching everything that's happened, and I'm here to remind you that your actions have consequences." Harper opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but no sound came out of his parched throat. He wanted to justify himself, to apologize, or at least to find an excuse for what he had done. But the man in front of him was so terrifying that the words were stuck on his tongue. This man was the embodiment of power and strength that Mr. Harper could no longer ignore. The man stepped forward, and Harper involuntarily retreated half a step backward, trying to avoid that gaze that was piercing him through and through. It was as if every crime he had ever committed, every insult he had ever inflicted, had suddenly become clear and undeniable. All the self-confidence he'd been so proud of crumbled to dust in front of this man, whose presence made him feel tiny and pathetic. "You thought you had the right to humiliate, tear, and destroy not only the thing, but also the dignity of a human being," the man continued, his voice so clear and powerful that it took everyone's breath away. "But you have forgotten that every action has a price." The crowd around him froze in anticipation, holding its breath, afraid to miss a single word. In every sound, in every movement of this man, there was a certainty that could not be faked. He continued to speak, and his words sounded like a sentence, like a reminder that justice does not always come quietly or unnoticed. You think your preconceptions protect you? That this store and the people around you will always be on your side? The man looked around, and many customers lowered their eyes as if they were caught in silent agreement. But the world is changing, and those who think they can humiliate others without consequences will be the losers. He paused, and in that silence, Mr. Harper felt as if he were on the edge of an abyss. The man's words were not merely a threat, but a promise behind which there was an inexorable power. Harper tried to remember who this man was, but one thing was clear to him. His power was greater than anything Harper had ever known. "Your career in this store is over," the man announced, the words sounding like a sentence from which there was no escape. "I will personally make sure that your actions are known and that you are never hired again in a place where honor and respect are important." Harper's eyes widened with horror. He tried to object, but the man interrupted him without raising his voice. "This is only the beginning. I'm going to make sure that you realize that it's not just wrong to humiliate people because of their color or origin. It is a crime against human dignity." Harper felt the ground go from under his feet. His face was deathly pale, and his knees barely kept him from falling. Now he realized this was no mere incident to be hushed up. It was the beginning of the end of his accustomed life, and justice, of which he had never thought, came to him in the most inexorable form. There was a heavy silence in the hall, interrupted only by the occasional nervous sighs of those who stood around, watching the scene unfold in fear. The gaze of the man, the father of the humiliated woman, was like a weapon that could crush any confidence, any attempt at resistance. It was harsh and merciless, filled with strength and determination, and it was that look that struck icy terror into the hearts of those who a moment ago had been silently supporting Mr. Harper. The man's eyes slid over the faces of those gathered, lingering on each of those who had previously looked on with approval or with indifference at the humiliation. One glance from him was capable of exposing their inner cowardice, and everyone felt exposed, as if this figure in the flesh could see their thoughts, their fears, their innermost, vile prejudices. The woman in the business suit, who had been nodding approvingly at Harper, now shrank back, trying to be inconspicuous. She averted her eyes, feeling a shiver run down her spine. The man with the expensive watch, who a few minutes ago had dared to say that people at her level don't know their place, was now sweating, his hand nervously adjusting his tie, his face scarlet with shame. He realized that his words were no longer protected by the confines of a society where prejudice could be justified. The cashiers, who had been idly watching all this, now cast confused glances at each other. One of them, a young man with a confused expression, instinctively took a step back, as if hoping to hide behind the counter. He felt like part of a mechanism that had been on the side of injustice for too long, but now that mechanism was breaking down right before their eyes. One of the senior staff members, a man with gray hair who had been proudly watching Harper, now glanced nervously toward the exit, clearly contemplating leaving the place as soon as possible. His smugness had evaporated, leaving only an expression of abject helplessness. He was one of those accustomed to power, backed by an unwritten right to humiliate others. But he saw something in that look that made him realize his vulnerability. Everyone who supported Harper, who looked at his actions approvingly or indifferently, felt their confidence evaporate. That look, like a silent sentence, passed over them, leaving them with a sense of utter exposure. The man seemed to see right through them, to understand every thought, every prejudice they lived by. People felt small and insignificant in front of this figure, in front of this gaze that did not shout, did not threaten, but evoked fear deeper and stronger than any words. He was the embodiment of a power that needed no loud speeches or ostentatious rage. There was a power in his calmness that could break down any barriers that supported injustice, and everyone could feel it. Even Mr. Harper, who until a short time ago had been confident of his inviolability, realized that he no longer had any protection. All the silent allies who had supported him or indulged his racist views now realized that they were standing on the edge of a precipice. One look from this man showed them that their world, based on prejudice and the certainty of impunity, had cracked. No one could hide behind masks of indifference any longer. Mr. Harper stood, paralyzed with terror, facing the man whose power and influence were now evident to everyone in the store. His lips trembled and a cold sweat trickled down his back. Suddenly, his whole world, built on the illusion of power and firmness, reinforced by his arrogance and the tacit support of those around him, collapsed, leaving him in a position he himself could not have imagined. He took an awkward step forward, but his body trembled treacherously. All eyes were fixed on him, and that realization only increased his panic. He tried to squeeze something out of himself that might save him, at least mitigate the effects a little. His voice, which usually sounded loud and self-assured, was now a low, intermittent whisper. "Yeah, I apologize," he mumbled, but his apology sounded unconvincing, pathetic. His voice shook, and every word seemed forced out, as if he was being forced to say something against his will. He looked at the woman standing next to her father, but there was no real remorse in his gaze, only the panic and despair of a man caught in a trap. "I didn't mean it, really," he continued, and it was clear from his face that he didn't believe what he was saying. His attempt to justify himself looked pathetic and hypocritical. "It was a misunderstanding. I was just trying to keep order." His words sounded more and more unconvincing, and with each sentence it became clear that he was only looking for a way out, not admitting his guilt. He spoke of order, of misunderstanding, as if he wanted to justify his actions with the formal phrases with which he was accustomed to cover his behavior. But in this place, in this situation, such excuses looked especially pathetic. The crowd was watching him, and there was no longer a shred of support in their gazes. People who had previously shared his prejudices, or at least silently tolerated them, now looked at his pathetic attempts to apologize with contempt. The man standing before him made Harper feel more and more insignificant with each passing second. In his presence, the cowardice of the salesman was more evident than ever. The woman with the tattered dress looked at Harper with a stern expression. She saw that his words carried no real remorse. She knew that this apology was not from the heart, but from fear, from the realization that he had lost control of the situation. She saw his hypocrisy, his attempts to gloss over what had happened, and realized that his humiliating remorse was not real, but forced. Mr. Harper looked once more at the man, whose gaze did not falter. It was the look of a man who saw right through him, who knew that this apology hid only cowardice and a desire to avoid consequences. Harper realized that his words would not undo what had happened, and that realization tore at him from the inside out. He knew that his humiliating excuses would not help him regain his lost power or respect, but would only further emphasize his insignificance. His every word seemed to echo in the empty echo, and in this room full of people, his weakness and hypocrisy became obvious to everyone. He was no longer the overbearing salesman who humiliated those he considered beneath him. Now he was just a coward who tried to escape justice, but could no longer find refuge in anything. From the moment Mr. Harper began his pathetic and unconvincing apology, the atmosphere in the store underwent a startling, almost ominous change. Until a few minutes ago, the place had been imbued with a racist confidence rooted in acquiescence and support. The walls of the store itself seemed to be imbued with a spirit of contempt and superiority that hung there as something familiar, immutable. But now it was all gone, and all that was left was a heavy, depressed silence. Those present, who had previously enjoyed watching the woman's humiliation, now looked as if their world had been turned upside down. Those who had allowed themselves mocking glances and approving whispers now stood with their eyes downcast, afraid to face what was unfolding right in front of them. Some shuffled nervously from foot to foot, not knowing where to place themselves. Others looked away, trying to get away from what had happened here as quickly as possible. The man in the business suit who had earlier nodded in support of Harper's words now stared at the floor, his face grim and pale with shame. His arms were crossed over his chest, but his fingers couldn't stop trembling. He felt as if he had been exposed, and his acquiescence to the seller's cruelty now burned a brand on his conscience. He tried to hide in the crowd, to become inconspicuous, but the sudden change of atmosphere prevented him from doing so. The old woman who had been watching with cold judgment and inward approval was now frantically hiding her face behind the collar of her shawl. Her breathing had become confused, and she was afraid to meet that stern, penetrating gaze of the man who was here to protect her daughter. It was as if anyone who had ever indulged in injustice now stood in his own judgment. People who were used to Harper's superiority and authority now looked pathetic, as if all their confidence had been ripped away. Cashiers who had been silently supporting what was happening were now nervously shifting papers or adjusting counters, avoiding looking toward the center of the room. They knew that silent complicity was something that could no longer be ignored, but they didn't know how to fix it, how to manage the chaos that suddenly filled the store. The shop windows, once shining with arrogance and firmness, now seemed empty and alien. The shoppers stood in a daze, as if they themselves had become part of the accusatory silence. Fear and the realization of their own weakness had replaced the former self-confidence. Now every person in that store felt exposed to what had happened. They could no longer hide behind politeness or the convenient illusion of innocence. Instead of the previous, almost palpable certainty that everything was going their way, there was now an overwhelming, suffocating silence. It was as if a veil had been lifted from their souls, revealing the truth. They were part of a system that supported humiliation and injustice. People realized that their inaction and silence had consequences, and now they felt complicit, caught off guard. No one else dared to even whisper. The old energy of hatred and superiority was replaced by an atmosphere of suppression and realization. The entire store seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. No one could ignore this moment. No one could pretend that nothing had happened. The system that they had used to think of as immutable had cracked, and now they didn't know how to bring back the old order. Mr. Harper stood there, feeling the world around him collapse with a rumble that only he could hear. His body was gripped by panic, his legs barely held up, and it felt like the ground beneath him was about to fail. He tried to comprehend everything that had just happened, but reality overwhelmed him with an avalanche of consequences that he hadn't even thought about when he had acted with the certainty that he was allowed to do anything. The man, the father of the woman whose power and influence shook the entire store, turned to the manager, who at this moment looked completely confused and pitiful. The manager, who until that moment had considered himself an important figure in this place, now felt insignificant as the man's anger descended upon him. "I hope you realize that this store is in serious trouble now," the man said with an icy calmness that was far more frightening than shouting. "Your reputation is already ruined, and I will personally make sure that everyone knows how people are treated here." The manager, pale and trembling, could hardly utter a word. "Pete, please," he mumbled, stammering. "We can make it right. We're willing to do anything." But the man paid no attention to him. He looked at Harper again, and in that look there was not merely rage but contempt for the man who had once thought himself superior to others. The salesman who had previously enjoyed his supposed power now looked pathetic, as if his soul had been torn as he had torn the woman's dress. "Minus Mr. Harper," the man said again, and now his voice sounded like a sentence. "You have just destroyed your life with your own hands. Your racism, your cruelty and hatred brought you here, and now you have to pay for it." Harper felt the words chill him with an icy dread. He tried to make excuses, to get out of this situation, but he couldn't think of anything. He realized that he had lost everything he thought was important. The career he had spent years building was now destroyed in the blink of an eye. There was no way to cover up what had happened, no chance of getting it all back. The store owner, hearing of the incident, would surely fire him, and Harper's name would be tarnished forever. No one would want to hire a man whose reputation was ruined by his own hatred. "Sherry, please," he started again, and now his voice was a barely audible whisper. "Yeah, I didn't know. I didn't mean to." But his words sounded hollow. Everyone could see that he was sorry, not for what he had done, but for the consequences that had come upon him. It was the remorse of a man who had realized that his privilege and self-confidence no longer protected him from responsibility. He had lost everything: respect, security, career, and worst of all, the realization that his life, his future, had been destroyed because of one act of hatred. The crowd around them began to disperse, and people left quietly, realizing that they had witnessed something important, something that could not be forgotten. They had seen how a man who was used to humiliating others had himself been humiliated and defeated. But now this store was not just a place where things were sold. It was a place of reckoning, a place where it seemed that justice, however belated, could be served even to the most arrogant. The woman with the torn dress no longer stood alone. Her father put his arm around her shoulders. His arm was strong, protective, a symbol that no one would ever humiliate her again. She met Harper's gaze, and there was no anger or forgiveness in her eyes. There was strength there, the strength of someone who had survived hatred and remained indestructible. Harper sank slowly into his chair, feeling his life turn to rubble right in front of him. He had lost everything because he couldn't see the other man as an equal, because his hatred had blinded him. The world around him was no longer a place where his power mattered. It was now a world where his past actions had cost him everything, and the future was shrouded in darkness and shame. That was the end of his story, a lesson in how one mistake born of hatred and prejudice can destroy everything that seemed immutable. Mr. Harper, once confident in his power, was now a broken man, lost in a world that no longer recognized his authority. Dear viewers, we would be very happy to know your opinion about this story. Do you think justice has been done? Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? Please share your stories and thoughts in the comments. Your voice is incredibly important. We appreciate each and every one of you, and thank you for your support. You are part of our community that helps make the world a little better, and every opinion counts. If you enjoyed our story, please subscribe to our channel and give us a like to support us in creating new stories. Thank you for being with us, and remember that you are very important to us. We hope your day is filled with kindness and light.